12 nannies quit in just 1 year. The millionaire was ready to give up until a black maid stepped into his mansion. The children tried everything to scare her off, but what happened next will leave you speechless. The mansion was enormous, a palace of glass and marble that sparkled in the sunlight. From the outside, it looked like perfection. Grand staircases, shining chandeliers, walls tall enough to touch the sky. Neighbors often slowed their cars to admire it, whispering about the millionaire who lived there. They imagined it must be a place of elegance and peace. But they were wrong. Inside those golden halls, chaos reigned. Every nanny who dared to step inside carried hope in her eyes and a promise in her heart. But none of them lasted. Some left in tears, clutching their bags as if escaping a war zone. Others ran out screaming before the day even ended. The halls that looked so beautiful echoed with slammed doors, shrieks, and angry cries. The reason? The millionaire's 7-year-old twins, Mason and Mia. They were clever, energetic, and, truth be told, heartbroken in ways most people couldn't see. But to the outside world, they had only one name: the Nightmare Twins. They screamed until their voices cracked. They fought with each other like sworn enemies. And their favorite pastime was torturing the nannies who came to care for them. One nanny walked into the playroom only to find her handbag glued shut. Another carefully laid out her clothes for the night. But by morning, every single one was covered in paint. A young nanny from France made the mistake of telling the twins she was afraid of insects. The next day, her breakfast tray was crawling with beetles. She lasted less than 24 hours. The twins thought it was hilarious. The staff thought it was terrifying. And for Richard, their father, it was exhausting. In his office, Richard sat slumped at his desk, the weight of responsibility pressing down like a mountain. He had the world at his fingertips, companies, wealth, power. But at home, he couldn't even keep one nanny for his children. The polished mahogany desk in front of him was littered with papers, contracts, and now, yet another resignation letter. He picked it up and read the words with a sigh. "I regret to inform you. I cannot continue. The children are unmanageable." The letters blurred as frustration burned in his chest. He tossed it aside, where a pile of similar letters already waited. Another one quits? His voice was tired, drained of the authority that had built his empire. Standing in the corner, his assistant shifted nervously, hands clasped tight. "Yes, sir. That's the 12th one this year." Richard leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. 12, he muttered. "And we're barely halfway through the year." His laugh was bitter, humorless. "At this rate, the agencies will start refusing us altogether." The assistant opened her mouth, then closed it again. What could she say? Everyone knew the truth. The job wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. Richard rubbed his temples, the memory of his late wife rising unbidden in his mind. She had been the glue that held everything together, the warmth in the mansion, the mother who knew how to quiet the storms inside Mason and Mia with a single touch. But she was gone, taken too soon, leaving him with 2 broken children and a life he no longer knew how to manage. He loved them. God, he loved them more than anything. But love wasn't enough when he was never home. His days were swallowed by boardrooms and phone calls, his nights by endless documents and meetings. He told himself he was doing it for them, for their future. But deep inside he knew the truth. They didn't need more money. They needed him. And he wasn't there. So he hired help. One nanny after another. Women with glowing resumes and perfect recommendations. Women who had raised children in royal families, who boasted patience and skill. But no matter how strong, no matter how experienced, each one broke under the chaos of Mason and Mia. The children didn't just misbehave. They tested. They pushed. They screamed not because they hated the nannies, but because they didn't believe anyone would stay. They dared every nanny to prove them wrong, and when she failed, it only confirmed what they already feared. Everyone leaves. The staff whispered about it in the kitchen late at night. "Did you hear? She's leaving too." How long did she last? 3 days. That's better than the last one. Then came the laughter, tired and bitter. Some joked about placing bets. Others admitted they were just glad it wasn't their job. But behind their whispers was unease. They avoided the twins whenever possible, fearful of becoming the next target of a cruel prank. Richard knew all of this. He saw the way the staff flinched when the twins entered the room. He heard the rumors that circled like smoke. And it broke him. Because no matter how out of control they were, those were his children, his flesh and blood, his last piece of the woman he loved. Late at night, when the mansion finally grew quiet, he often sat alone in his office, staring at a photograph on his desk. His wife's smile glowed from the frame, her arms wrapped around Mason and Mia when they were just toddlers. They had been so small, so full of joy back then. The sound of their giggles used to fill the house. Now only screams echoed through its halls. "What do I do?" he whispered to the picture, his voice breaking in the silence. "How do I fix this?" But the photograph, of course, gave no answer. Richard ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion pulling at him. He didn't just need another nanny. He didn't need someone with perfect credentials or flawless references. He needed someone who wouldn't quit. Someone who could see past the chaos, past the tantrums, past the tricks, and find the children buried underneath. He needed a miracle. And then she arrived. The next morning, Richard's assistant stepped into his office with an uncertain expression. "Sir, there's a woman here about the nanny position, but she's different. She doesn't have the usual documents." Richard barely looked up. "Different? How?" The door creaked open before she could answer, and a figure stepped inside. Not in a crisp uniform. Not carrying a leather folder of achievements. She walked in with calm eyes, steady steps, and a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. Richard glanced up, surprised, and for a brief moment, just a flicker, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Her name was Clara. A woman in her late 30s with warm brown skin, tired eyes, and a quiet confidence that seemed unshakable. She wasn't like the polished, uniformed nannies Richard usually hired. She wore a simple faded dress, her shoes slightly worn, and her hair tied back neatly. She carried no leather-bound resume, no folder of glowing recommendations, and no fancy smile rehearsed for interviews. Still, when she entered the room, there was something about her presence that made the air feel steady. Richard studied her from behind his massive desk. He had interviewed dozens of women before, many younger, many better dressed, many with lists of credentials longer than a business contract. But Clara didn't try to impress him. She just stood calmly, her hands folded, as if she knew she belonged there. "Why should I hire you?" Richard finally asked, his voice sharp, testing. He expected hesitation, nervousness, maybe even excuses. But Clara simply smiled. It wasn't a forced professional smile. It was warm, almost tired, but real. "Because I won't quit," she said softly. "No matter what your children throw at me." Richard's eyebrows shot up. He almost laughed. She doesn't know what she's getting into, he thought. Every nanny before her had said the same thing in one way or another. "I'm patient. I'm experienced. I've dealt with difficult children before." And yet, every single one had left, broken by Mason and Mia. But there was something in Clara's tone, calm, steady, certain, that made him pause. He didn't quite believe her, but he was desperate. He leaned back in his chair, rubbed his temples, and finally muttered, "Fine. You're hired." Clara bowed her head slightly, as though she'd expected nothing less. The first meeting with the twins was nothing short of explosive. Richard led Clara down the wide staircase toward the playroom, where the echoes of shrill laughter already filled the hall. Mason and Mia were in the middle of chasing each other, their toys scattered across the floor like landmines. The moment the twins saw her, they froze. Their faces hardened instantly, like little soldiers preparing for battle. "Another one?" Mason sneered, his small hand clutching a toy car. "Didn't the last one run away?" Mia crossed her arms, her chin tilted high. "We don't need a maid. You'll quit like the rest." Before Richard could even respond, Mason hurled the toy car. It bounced against the floor just inches from Clara's feet. The sound cracked through the room like a warning shot. Richard tensed, ready for the usual reaction. He had seen it countless times before, nannies gasping, shouting, scolding the children, or storming out in outrage. He half expected Clara to turn on her heel and leave right then. But Clara didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't snap, didn't scold. Instead, she slowly lowered herself to the floor, kneeling until her eyes were level with theirs. The twins blinked in surprise. No one had ever done that before. In a voice as calm as still water, Clara said, "I'm not here to boss you around. I'm here to listen." For a moment, silence filled the room. Mason's hands tightened around another toy, ready to throw, but he hesitated. Mia's lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to figure Clara out. Richard, watching from the doorway, felt a strange ripple of confusion. He had expected shouting, resistance, chaos. But instead, the room had gone still. The twins didn't know it then, but something in Clara's tone was different. For the first time, someone wasn't trying to control them. Mason broke the silence first. "You'll leave," he said stubbornly, almost like a dare. "They all leave." Clara tilted her head, her tired eyes never leaving his. "Maybe they did, but I'm not them." Mia snorted. "You say that now. Wait until we drive you crazy." Clara's smile didn't fade. "You can try," she said, almost playfully. "But you'll see I don't scare easy." The twins glanced at each other, and for a brief second, something passed between them. It wasn't amusement, and it wasn't victory. It was curiosity. They didn't want to admit it, but Clara didn't sound like the others. The nannies before her always came in barking rules, setting boundaries, scolding them for being wild. Clara didn't. She came in promising nothing but to stay and to listen. Of course, Mason and Mia weren't about to let her off that easily. If she really thought she could survive them, they would make sure to prove her wrong. That night, Richard sat in his office long after the children had gone to bed, replaying the scene in his mind. He had watched Clara stand in the storm of his children's chaos without raising her voice, without trembling. It was strange, almost unsettling. "Maybe she'll last a few days," he muttered to himself, trying not to hope. "A week, if we're lucky." But deep down, a thought stirred, quiet, fragile, almost unbelievable. What if she's different? Upstairs, Mason and Mia whispered in the dark. "She's not like the others," Mason admitted reluctantly. "She'll still leave," Mia insisted, though her voice wasn't as strong as usual. "Maybe," Mason said, rolling onto his side. "But what if she doesn't?" They didn't know it yet, but Clara's words had planted something in them. Something small but powerful. For the first time in years, the twins felt a strange, unfamiliar possibility. That maybe, just maybe, someone wasn't going to give up on them. The next few days were a test of patience, a battle of wills that would have sent any other nanny running. Mason and Mia were determined to break Clara, to prove she was no different than the rest. They had perfected the art of chaos, and they were ready to unleash it. It started small. At breakfast one morning, Mason waited until Clara set a tray of orange juice on the table. He gave Mia a mischievous grin, then accidentally tipped his glass over, sending a stream of juice splattering across the white carpet. The bright orange stain spread quickly, and Mia burst out laughing. Any other nanny would have scolded, panicked, or rushed for towels in frustration. But Clara simply knelt down with a cloth, blotting the mess without a single complaint. "Oops," Mason said with fake innocence, waiting for her to snap. Clara glanced up at him and smiled. "Good thing juice washes out easier than paint. You're lucky I'm not mad about this." Then she calmly continued cleaning, humming softly as if the whole thing didn't matter at all. The twins exchanged confused looks. She wasn't supposed to act like that. The next day, Mia decided to up the game. She had discovered a small box of frogs near the garden, and with Mason's help, she slipped them into Clara's shoes, carefully tucking them inside so they would wriggle at just the right moment. When Clara came to slip her feet into the shoes, she paused, feeling the movement. She looked down, pulled one shoe off, and out hopped a frog. Mason and Mia burst into laughter, already preparing to watch her scream. But Clara only chuckled. She bent down, gently picked up the little creature, and said, "Well, hello there." You brought me a friend." She set the frog back outside in the garden and turned to the twins, smiling warmly. "Nice try. But I grew up in the country. Frogs don't scare me." The twins blinked in disbelief. This wasn't how the game was supposed to go. The frogs were supposed to send her shrieking and storming out the door. Instead, she acted as though it was nothing more than a small inconvenience, even a joke she shared with them. By the third day, they were desperate to see her break. That afternoon, while Clara was in the kitchen preparing their snacks, they quietly locked the back door and ran to the window, watching as she walked into the garden with a watering can. When she returned and found the door locked, the twins pressed their faces to the glass, giggling hysterically. They waited for the banging, the shouting, the scolding. But it never came. Instead, Clara set the watering can down, sat herself comfortably on the grass, and began to hum a tune. Her voice was low and gentle, carrying across the garden like a lullaby. She closed her eyes, leaned back on her hands, and tilted her face toward the sun. The twins stared at her through the glass. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. She didn't call for help. She didn't pound the door. She simply sat there as if being locked outside was a pleasant break. Eventually, curiosity got the better of them. Mason tiptoed to the door and unlocked it. Clara walked in without a single word of reproach. She smiled and said, "Thank you for letting me back in. Now who's hungry?" And just like that, the moment passed. The children were confused. Why wasn't she yelling? Why wasn't she packing her bags and running away? It made no sense. Every other nanny had cracked by now, raising her voice, losing her patience, or quitting on the spot. But Clara was different. She absorbed their chaos like water over stone, untouched, unshaken. That night, as they lay in their beds, Mason whispered to his sister. "She's different," he muttered, his brow furrowed. Mia rolled onto her side. "Maybe, but she still won't last." Her voice was sharp, but there was hesitation in it now. They were used to being abandoned. They almost expected it. To them, every adult eventually left. And they were certain Clara would too. But Clara, listening from the hallway as she folded blankets, had caught their whispers. And for the first time since arriving, she let her smile fade. Not because she was discouraged, but because she finally understood. Beneath all the tantrums, the tricks, and the wild energy, Mason and Mia weren't just bad kids. They were lonely. She saw it in their eyes when they thought no one was looking. The way Mason lingered by the window at night, staring at the driveway, waiting for his father to come home. The way Mia clutched a stuffed rabbit that was missing one ear, holding it tightly as if it were the only comfort she had left. They weren't misbehaving because they enjoyed cruelty. They were crying out in the only way they knew how. Their father was always busy. Meetings stretched into late nights. Business trips carried him away for days at a time. They rarely saw him for more than a rushed dinner or a distracted kiss on the head. And their mother's absence left a wound too deep for words. She had been gone for years, but her absence lingered like a shadow in every corner of the house. The mansion was full of chandeliers and marble floors, but it was empty of what mattered most: love, patience, and the kind of attention children craved. Clara realized then that the twins' pranks weren't really challenges. They were questions. Will you stay? Will you love us even when we push you away? Will you still be here tomorrow? And Clara, unlike all the others before her, had no intention of running. So she came up with a plan. The next morning, the children expected rules. They expected punishment for the tricks they had pulled the day before. They expected Clara to scold them, to wag her finger and set boundaries like every other adult had. But when they shuffled into the living room, rubbing their sleepy eyes, what they found waiting on the floor stopped them in their tracks. Laid out neatly on a blanket were jars of paint, stacks of paper, and, most unusual of all, an old guitar resting against the couch. Clara sat cross-legged beside it, her face calm as always. "Today," she said, "I'm not your nanny." She tapped her chin with a paintbrush, her eyes twinkling. "I'm your teammate." The twins blinked in surprise. "Teammate?" Mason repeated, suspicious. "Yes," Clara replied. "We're going to build something together. No tricks, no rules, no punishments. just teamwork. For a moment, the children hesitated. It had to be a trick. Adults never played like this. But Clara didn't move, didn't rush them. She just dipped her brush into a pot of bright red paint and began to draw swirling shapes across the paper. Slowly, Mason's curiosity overcame his doubt. He sat down and picked up a brush. He dipped it into blue and dragged it across the paper in messy streaks. Mia, trying not to show too much interest, reached out and plucked at the guitar strings, the rough sound filling the air like a question. Clara smiled and sang a little tune to match the off-key notes. Within an hour, the room looked completely different. Paint splattered across the papers, across the floor, even on the children's faces. Mason laughed, so hard he nearly fell over when Clara painted a mustache on his upper lip. Mia giggled uncontrollably as Clara strummed the guitar in silly rhythms to match her laughter. For the first time in years, the mansion wasn't echoing with screams. It was alive, with color, with music, with joy. Day by day, Clara became their anchor. She showed Mason how to cook scrambled eggs, letting him stir the pan until the kitchen filled with the smell of breakfast. She played soccer with him in the garden, chasing the ball even when her shoes slipped on the grass. With Mia, she patiently braided her hair, weaving strands together while telling funny stories from her childhood. Stories of climbing trees, falling in rivers, and once accidentally chasing a goat through her grandmother's garden. The twins, who had once chased every nanny away, now chased Clara through the halls, laughing as they begged for one more game, one more song, one more story. But the change wasn't just in the children. It was in Richard, too. One evening, he came home earlier than usual. He expected to find the mansion in its familiar state, quiet, cold, filled with the lingering tension of a long day. Instead, as he stepped through the door, he heard music. Following the sound, he stopped at the doorway of the living room. His heart clenched at the sight. Clara sat on the couch, strumming the guitar gently. Mason and Mia were curled up on the floor, painting side by side. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyes bright, and their laughter filled the room. Richard stood frozen. He hadn't seen his children like this in years. For so long, he had convinced himself that they were unmanageable, too wild to control, too broken to heal. Yet here they were, calm, happy, alive, because of one woman who refused to give up on them. He realized then that Clara had done something extraordinary. She had walked into the storm his children carried with them and refused to be swept away. She had reached into their chaos and found the children they truly were, lonely, hurting, but still capable of love. Weeks passed, and the bond only deepened. The twins began to ask for Clara at bedtime, tugging at her sleeve with sleepy eyes. They begged her to read stories, to sing songs, to stay until they drifted off. And though Richard sometimes watched from the doorway, aching with guilt that he couldn't give them the same comfort, he also felt a strange relief. At last, someone was there for them when he couldn't be. Then one night, something happened that shook him to his core. After the house had gone quiet, Clara was folding blankets in her small room when she heard a knock at her door. It wasn't loud, more like a timid tapping. When she opened it, Mason and Mia stood there in their pajamas, clutching their stuffed animals. "Can we sleep here?" Mia whispered, her eyes wide. "We don't want to be alone." Clara's heart melted. She knelt down and opened her arms, and the twins rushed into them. She led them to her bed, tucking them under the blanket as though they were her own. Then she sat beside them and began to sing. Her voice was soft, low, full of warmth, a lullaby that seemed to reach into their very bones. Mason's eyelids fluttered shut first. Mia clung to her stuffed rabbit a moment longer before her breathing slowed into sleep. These were the same children who had never listened to bedtime stories, who had slammed doors in every nanny's face, who had sworn they didn't need anyone. And now they were asleep within minutes, safe in Clara's presence. Richard passed by the doorway that night and stopped. He saw his children curled against Clara, saw the peace on their faces, and felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt since his wife was alive. It was then that he realized Clara had done the impossible. Richard began noticing changes, not just in the twins, but in himself. It started subtly, almost without him realizing. For years he had buried himself in work, convincing himself it was for the children, that the money, the house, the security would make up for his absence. But now, something pulled him away from his office earlier each day. It was the sound of laughter. Real, unrestrained laughter echoing through the golden halls that had once been so silent. He would step into the mansion and find Mason and Mia smiling instead of scowling, hugging instead of fighting. They said things he never thought he'd hear from their lips. Thank you, please, and good night, Dad. Each word landed like a miracle. One evening, Richard walked into the kitchen, briefcase still in hand, and froze at the sight before him. Mason, standing on a stool, carefully stirred a pot of soup, his face serious with concentration. Beside him, Mia set the table, her little hands carefully arranging the forks and spoons with precision. And Clara stood in the middle, her calm presence weaving everything together as she guided them gently, her voice warm and steady. The millionaire felt tears sting his eyes. For so long, this house had been a cold palace, filled with chandeliers and marble, but empty of life. Now, with the soft glow of the kitchen lights and the smell of dinner filling the air, it finally felt like something he hadn't realized he was missing. It finally felt like a family. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Richard found Clara in the garden. She was sitting on the bench with a cup of tea in her hands, gazing up at the stars. For a moment, he just watched her, struck by the quiet strength she carried. Then he stepped forward. How did you do it? His voice cracked despite himself. How did you change them? I've tried everything, doctors, tutors, the best nanny's money can buy. No one lasted. But you, he shook his head, almost in disbelief. You've done what seemed impossible. Clara turned to him, her eyes soft. She smiled faintly, not with pride, but with the calm certainty of someone who had always known the answer. Children don't need perfection, she said simply. They just need love, the kind that doesn't quit. The words struck him deeper than he expected. For years, he had been chasing perfection. Perfect deals, perfect staff, perfect routines. But in the process, he had forgotten the one thing that mattered most. From that day forward, something shifted in Richard too. Clara was no longer just a maid or a nanny. She became part of the family. The twins adored her. They clung to her hand when they walked outside. They begged her to stay when bedtime came. And they showered her with the kind of affection they had once withheld from everyone. And to Richard's quiet surprise, he found himself drawn to her presence as well. She had not only healed his children, she had softened him. He laughed more. He sat at the dinner table instead of eating alone in his office. He learned the stories Mason wanted to tell, and he let Mia braid his hair just to see her giggle. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, Richard would stand by the doorway of the twins' room. He'd watch them sleeping peacefully, their small bodies curled up under the blanket Clara had tucked in. And each time, his chest tightened with gratitude, because he knew that without her, this peace would never have been possible. The woman everyone doubted, the woman no one believed could handle the nightmare twins, had not only tamed them, but healed them. One afternoon, months later, Richard was preparing for another business trip. He zipped his suitcase shut, glancing at his watch. But before he could leave, Mason and Mia rushed in, blocking the door. "Don't go," Mason cried, his small fists clutching his father's sleeve. "Stay home, Daddy," Mia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Richard froze. In the past, they never cared when he left. If anything, they seemed happier when he was gone. But now they wanted him, needed him. And for the first time, Richard listened. He set his suitcase aside, knelt down, and pulled his children into his arms. "I'll stay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll stay." Clara watched from the hallway, and Richard knew, deep down, that none of it would have been possible without Clara. She had walked into his home as a maid, but she had become their miracle. She did the impossible. Clara didn't just tame the millionaire's twins. She gave them back their childhood. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us miracles are real.